Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Gay Purr-ee from 1962. And this is a winner of the Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. And this movie was selected by Dan Leone. Gay Purr-ee is the second feature from UPA, the incredibly influential animation studio who are mostly known for shorts. Although they've had television productions and feature films, most of their influence comes from their shorts, not from actual features or anything like that. So it's interesting to talk about one of the two features that they did make. And this is also kind of different from most UPA productions, has a lot of involvement from Chuck Jones. He did not direct this film. It was directed by Abe Levitow, I believe, who worked under Chuck Jones. It was written by Chuck Jones, and many would argue the characters were designed by Chuck Jones, or the people who worked on it worked with Chuck Jones and are so used to that style. You could argue that. I couldn't find confirmed that he designed the character designs, but while I was watching it, I didn't realize Chuck Jones wrote it with his wife, Dorothy, so I sort of thought it was just very influenced by him, but I definitely noted that looks very much like Chuck Jones to me. This director would go on to direct The Phantom Tollbooth with Chuck Jones, so he was involved creatively, but it's definitely not as headlined with him. And it's sort of probably most known as being the Paris Cats movie that is not the Aristocats. But I think this movie is a little more notable in some regard. I don't think it's perfect. Aristocats isn't perfect either, but I have some nostalgic love for that, and we watch it a lot because we have cats and a little kid and stuff. But Gay Purr-ee basically is about a cat voiced by Judy Garland, who's in a farm in rural Provence, who hears about Paris, France. This all takes place in France, but no one speaks French, so, American filmmaking, I don't know. So she hears about Paris and very much wants to go there, and stows away and leaves Provence and leaves this guy, Juan Tom, voiced by Robert Goulet, and leaves him behind so she can go off, but he chases after her with a little kitten that follows along, and they kind of get mixed up in the kind of chaos and a con man cat in Paris who takes advantage of all of them. She's going to be sold off as a wife to a very rich fat cat who I don't think see a picture of, and then they are kind of shanghaied off, I guess is the term. I don't know if that's a good term, but basically what they do is they'd get you drunk, really drunk, put you on a ship, you'd wake up on the ship, and then you'd be forced to work there. A typical idea of a kind of hayseed kind of person goes to a big city and gets completely taken advantage of and has a horrible time because cities are evil and stuff. For me, I think the plot of Gay Purr-ee is not its strong suit. It kind of meshes around between various things, and although it has a really great voice cast, Judy Garland, I think this is the only cartoon she ever did, which is unfortunate. This kind of makes me think about what would it have been like if classic Hollywood actors were actually in animation the way we have Hollywood actors and stuff today. Frankly, that sounds amazing to me. I wish that had happened more, but it didn't. You get certain George Sanders and Jungle Book and a few, but you don't really get that, and it would have been cool to see so many great actors who have amazing voices in animated films at the time. So it's cool to hear Judy Garland as Musette. I didn't know Robert Goulet that well, other than being a joke in The Simpsons. I actually had to look up why was he famous, and it was because of the famous Broadway musical Camelot, where Julie Andrews came from, which was a big deal in the 60s. If you're wondering, was it a big deal? It was like the Hamilton of its day. It really was. One thing I like about this is the animation in this, and UPA is known for its limited animation. Now, unlike Hanna-Barbera, which did it to make lots of money, UPA, which still made lots of money, but did it for an artistic reason because they thought they liked the way it looked and things like that. It was a different style from what was going on in the more traditional animation for most studios. So it was an actual artistically exciting studio when it came out. I think limited animation now, because of we think of the Hanna-Barbera and the cost cutting that they realized they could take advantage of from the UPA style, it's been portrayed in a different way. But when UPA came out with Gerald McBoing Boing and various shorts like that, it was very much a big, change in animation. It was a different way to do it than the, highly, incredibly well animated stuff that was coming out of the studios, which I still like, but it is sort of just a different artistic idea. That doesn't work as well with a feature, at least this attempt. I think what does really work is they were always kind of thinking of different ways to animate things, particularly the backgrounds could be surreal or weirder or more interesting and inviting, and that's how this film really works. Now, the character design is Chuck Jones, which, for 1962 wasn't honestly that radical, but it's still, Chuck Jones is still a genius and it's still really beautiful. And whether Chuck Jones did it or it's very Chuck Jones influence, I guess we could debate all day, but it definitely looks that way. But all the backgrounds and all the cityscapes are done in a different style, which really kind of pops out at you in a way, because most of the time you see a design of a character, it's designed the same way, the background's designed the same way, it's like that reality. But the reality of this, all the characters are designed differently than the backgrounds, which are trying to be like Van Gogh and other French artists at the turn of the century, which kind of gets you more into it in a more cooler artistic way. Particularly, the other thing this does very well is having these kind of musical dream sequences. Some of the songs, it's like Take My Hand, Purr-ee, and all the kind of the musical sequences when they kind of like go off and get more experimental are really great, and I really love that. And especially the detail and the kind of artistic differences you'll see in this. There's sometimes they stick very much on model, and other times, like, I don't know what model they're using, but it's definitely not what you're used to in the film. And the film is like open to this kind of experimentation, which I think is what was so great about UPA as a studio. They'd be very simplistic, very minimal, but in other times they could, kind of really shine in like weirder ways that you wouldn't really expect. You never knew what you're going to get from them in a lot of ways, even though they'd be very conventional in their storytelling, in their actual the visuals or the animation in their films that would break out from that. And they did that in ways that I guess, would, when the film would allow. I haven't seen their other film, but I don't think this one really gets into that as well. It seemed like they just, were a big studio. That's what a big animation studio is supposed to do, I guess. And so that's, I guess, what they did. But as a film, I think the thing with this is you have a kind of typical story of, people come to the big city and they get taken advantage of. I don't love that kind of story. I actually kind of often feel like I would love to see a film that does the reverse rather than this. Like, I get a little bored of this kind of a story, which is not that interesting. It did feel a little darker than most of those because of how taken advantage of and how hurt these people were within this story. But I think what really kind of works about it is Judy Garland and Robert Goulet are good Hollywood studio trained kind of actors, theatrically, all those things. So I think when you get those kind of actors in an animated film, it really works. And specifically that all the songs were written by the primary songwriters from Wizard of Oz, which Judy Garland brought along to this. And Judy Garland, like, it's also, if you think of 50s, 60s Judy Garland, I don't think, other than A Star Is Born, which she was in, I don't really like a lot of those films a lot when I've seen them, but I really liked her in this. And I wasn't thinking about her reputation or who she was in the 50s or 60s, and it kind of freed me with her. And I'm wondering if that's one of the reasons she took this on, because there's so much baggage attached to her, particularly at that point, that I'm wondering, like, doing an animated film felt freeing, because she can be this cat and you're just, I really just thought of her as the cat. I wasn't thinking about Judy Garland. I feel like oftentimes when I'm watching later Judy Garland films, I'm just thinking of her. As much as I love her in Wizard of Oz and other films, I'm not as attached to her whole filmography. It's not a real criticism. I haven't seen everything or anything like that. But one of the things that this probably film is more notable for is kind of the behind the scenes things that happen with it. And it doesn't involve Judy Garland or Robert Goulet, who is also good, by the way, who I feel like I'm sort of getting more of who he was, other than, playing Bart's treehouse in that Simpsons episode. So basically, Chuck Jones was involved in this film. He helped write it at least, and presumably maybe did something else. And when he was working on it, he had an exclusive deal with Warner Brothers, and this was a UPA production. Now, when UPA eventually decided to sell the distribution rights to Warner Brothers watched this and noticed that, hey, this guy we have an exclusive deal with worked on this movie. So they, of course, after the cartoon that he was working on, fired him, and he had to leave Warner Brothers. So this ended probably one of the greatest partnerships of all of animation, Chuck Jones with Warner Brothers Animation, which is pretty insane. And they did release it, and it was a box office bomb. I saw that Judy Garland and Robert Goulet actually appeared on The Tonight Show with Jack Parr to promote this. It seemed like they did put a bunch of promotional weight behind this. They appeared together a couple times, things like that, but it just didn't take. And the reviews were a little mixed. I think plotline wise, this film is probably more notable for its animation than its plot. And I do think in some ways the writing and the way this film moves is very much of its time. It doesn't feel as universal as, like, I feel like obviously this gets compared to Aristocats. I think what works about that film is that film works in a way that plays more for modern audiences. I think this one might be a harder sell, although I was thinking of playing this for my daughter possibly, and I do like it to a certain regard, but I think it kind of gets a little lost and then kind of like brings itself back together at the end. Like, you're like, how are they all going to get back to Paris? How is she going to get out of this? Like, do any of their owners care that they've clearly been run away for long months at a time? But having, like, you know, the idea of, you know, dogs or cats alone in a city on their own kind of film, I find this to be a much more interesting one, particularly because of how UPA did the animation. Even though the songs aren't memorable, I agree with that, which pretty much everyone said who's reviewed this. I think the sequences that the songs are in are all really great. I remember, like, the fish she's sitting on and she's imagining what Paris is like. And I remember the Bubbles song. I sort of remember the Bubbles song. I remember the animation of that very well. And I think it shows, like, what UPA was good at was capturing your eye and showing you how we're going to interpret this different than Warner Brothers or Disney or anything else that's going on. This is UPA. We are kind of the new school of animation. Certainly there would kind of be almost a sidestep for most people, and the Hanna-Barbera stuff would take off. But the one thing that's really great about this is seeing Judy Garland's voice animated. I think that's something we've never gotten any other film, and that definitely makes this notable. I mean, Judy Garland with Chuck Jones, that's a pretty amazing feat, whether he would, you know, just him writing and everything like that. And I do think this film gets darker and funnier in some cases, in terms of like how it comes about things. I like the character designs of the con man cat's henchmen. I thought was actually really cool. They're these cats, and like sometimes it looks like they have one eye or something. That's a really cool kind of UPA simple design in there that I really like that design a lot. I thought that was really cool. I like when design is simple like that. It seemed like sometimes they do the Chuck Jones thing, sometimes they do something a little different, kind of subtleties within that. I'm sure if you're an animation nerd, this is a really cool watch, because I often like what I've said a lot about animated films that were going on before there were like studios other than Disney, is that you kind of get to see different voices develop in different weirder ways than what you'd expect. You think, like, what if UPA had made more features? Really, this film isn't different enough, and like if we're comparing it to Aristocats, I know that film's not perfect, but that film kind of understands like how to basically make a fun, entertaining film, and that's predominantly what it's trying to do. Whereas I think Gay Purr-ee is trying to say all these things about the city and having all these songs, and it doesn't have a distinct place of where it's going to go. It kind of wants to bring up all these things about the city. It kind of wants to say all these things about Paris. It wants to say how these people can take advantage of, or life takes advantage of you, or career, or things like that. But it wasn't necessarily clear about that. It kind of like jumps around from being silly, and it feels like someone who did make shorts but didn't really entirely, you can get away with something like this in a short, but when you drag this thing out, it does feel a little long in the tooth in some places. And it had a good voice cast. Mel Blanc was in it as well, Paul Frees, Robert Goulet, Judy Garland, all that stuff. I think this is kind of a very notable animated film, and if you're an animation nerd, and especially thinking of like different ways to think about animation, like having a different style in the backgrounds than your character design is actually really cool. I wish more animated films would do that. Not enough animated stuff does do that. We kind of like the consistency, especially now, unfortunately, but it kind of shows you what UPA can do. And in animation wise, I find this film incredibly interesting and fascinating. On a script level, I've seen this movie too many times, and I don't think this does it in a way that's more interesting. I mean, sure, going to Alaska for the gold rush is kind of weird. I kind of like that. I sort of like certain aspects of it. I like that this is, Paris and not, an American city, but it is still like the same thing of like the evils of the city and all these things. And it's just like, I don't entirely agree with that and think it's a little stupid at a certain point. But anyway, I think Gay Purr-ee, if you're into animation and you're an animation nerd, it's a good watch, and it'll make you think about different processes and things like that. And for that, I think it's actually really great. But for an actual movie, for people to enjoy, I don't know if it necessarily goes beyond that kind of animation fascination of what it is. And I think you could probably watch better and more influential shorts that UPA made. But as a kind of like interesting footnote, I think it's definitely worth a watch. So if you have seen Gay Purr-ee and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And this is a winner of the Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. Thank you very much for watching.